It's Wednesday, December 3rd, 5 p.m. in Washington, D.C. I'm Amira David, and you're watching RT America. We begin with the breaking news today in New York City, where a grand jury has reportedly declined to indict an officer in the death of Eric Garner. Now, Garner died back in July from a police chokehold after a heated altercation with police after he was reportedly found illegally selling tobacco. That video went viral last summer, particularly because of Garner's last words to the police, which were, "I can't breathe." Take a look.
And within all that time, the guy was still around his neck.
Put your hand behind your back. I can't breathe. 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 I can't breathe.
The death of Garner, who was black, incited tensions between the NYPD and minority communities at the time. And now that tension is expected to resurface after last week's riots in Ferguson and across the country over a grand jury decision not to indict Officer Darren Wilson. Joining me with the very latest in this case is RT's Alexei Yaroshevsky from New York. Alexei, talk to me about this case. What exactly did the grand jury have to determine in order to make this decision?
We know, at the moment, we know very little about what actually led the grand jury to come up with such a decision. There's only been very short statements, particularly the latest one from the district attorney of Staten Island, that the grand jury found no reasonable cause to believe that the officer was responsible for the death of Eric Garner and that he should be indicted. We don't even know what kind of charges the grand jury was considering, but we do know that the video which went viral after July 17th, where it really looks like a chokehold was used on Eric Garner, and which led to his death. The medical examiner later said that later classified his death as a homicide, and essentially now we can see that the police officer who was responsible for that will walk free. We are waiting on more statements coming from the authorities here. We're actually expecting the New York Mayor de Blasio to speak in a short while, but there's been a lot of rage about that decision already, I should say.
Certainly has been. The tensions are heightened now just a week after the Ferguson grand jury decision, which declined to indict Officer Darren Wilson. What kind of reactions are we seeing, and what should we expect to see tonight, perhaps?
You know, the grand jury decision in Ferguson happened just 10 days ago. I was in the middle of it, and immediately after it came out, a lot of evidence was read out by the authorities. It was pretty much published just minutes after the decision was made. Here, it's a different story. People do not know what exactly led the grand jury to believe, and that's why if you go online, you can see a lot of rage directed at the judicial system in America, at the grand jury, at the police. People are literally very, very angry at what happened, and we know that they are taking to the streets. In fact, in 1 hour from now, at New York's Union Square, a protest will start. Then supposedly the protest will march towards the Times Square or even the Rockefeller Center, where the Christmas tree was supposed to be, is supposed to be light up today, but we're not sure if this ceremony will take place at all, because the New York mayor said he would not attend the ceremony due to safety concerns. The police are, of course, on high alert. We can see and can hear the police cars cruising around the Midtown area, and obviously it might get violent and dangerous, particularly after last week the Big Apple saw a lot of protests related to the story in Ferguson. This time, of course, with Eric Garner's story, it's more domestic, and things may actually turn ugly. And we're, of course, will be there to monitor the situation, and we'll update our viewers as we see things on the ground at Union Square and other protest sites in New York.
We are indeed expecting some protests here in Washington, D.C., and we'll continue to follow this story. It's certainly not the end. Okay, RT correspondent Alexei Yaroshevsky from our New York studio, thank you. To give us a more detailed look at Eric Garner's case, RT's Manila Chan breaks down the timeline of events that led to his death.
The country is bracing for more potential outrage today as yet another grand jury decision not to indict, this time an NYPD officer, for the chokehold death of Eric Garner on Staten Island. Now here's the timeline of how the events have unfolded. On July 17th, officers approached Mr. Garner in front of a bodega. They alleged he was selling cigarettes untaxed, or better known as loosies. Before long, Garner was wrestled to the ground by several plainclothes officers, but one officer in particular, Daniel Pantaleo, used a method long banned by the NYPD. That's the chokehold. The chokehold has been banned by the NYPD for over 20 years. Now, the man who recorded the video posts it to YouTube, and it catches a media firestorm. On July 19th, just 2 days following the incident, Reverend Al Sharpton hosts a rally in Garner's memory as his grieving wife collapses in his arms. That gathering would then become a march for justice for Eric Garner. As the march unfolds, the policeman who placed Garner in that chokehold is stripped of his badge and his gun. Now, July 20th, a brand new video emerges on YouTube. It picks up where that first video left off. This time it shows Garner motionless on the ground as police await emergency workers to arrive. Now, upon arrival, EMS workers do very little but to maybe check his vitals. The 7-minute video shows not one officer or emergency worker attempting to revive Garner. No CPR, no oxygen masks, nothing of the sort that we're so used to seeing from medical aid workers when they arrive. Now, the following day, on July 21st, after the EMS video surfaces, the hospital, which employs the EMS and paramedics, suspends all of those who responded without pay. The community is outraged at the lack of care and treatment for the lifeless Garner, claiming that the workers let him die. Now, people who knew him call him a gentle giant and say that the 43-year-old was a known asthmatic. Now, the death of this Parks and Rec employee leaves his wife to care for 6 children, one of which was just 3 months old at the time of Garner's death. Now, by July 23rd, Garner's funeral service renews a new conversation about police brutality. Mind you, this is still several weeks before the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. Al Sharpton and other civil rights leaders pressed for an indictment following the medical examiner's ruling that Garner's death was indeed a homicide. But those cries wouldn't be heard until September 29th, when a grand jury first convened to review the evidence against Officer Pantaleo, which leads us now to today. More than 2 months after the grand jury began their meetings, they've now arrived at the decision not to indict the NYPD officer who placed Eric Garner in a chokehold, which resulted in his untimely death. Now, this is sure to fan the flames of an already racially charged divide between the public and the police across America. In Washington, Manila Chan, RT.
To talk more about this grand jury decision, I'm joined by Ronald E. Hampton, a retired police officer with the D.C. Metro Police, and Amy Frame, the Director of Digital Strategy at Million Hoodies Movement for Justice. Thank you both for joining me. I want to get your immediate reaction to the announcement. Ronald, first, are you surprised that the grand jury came to this decision?
Oh, no, I'm not surprised. I mean, New York has law enforcement and the prosecutors in New York have a long history of not bringing charges against people. What we had to realize is that the charges that have been brought against police officers in the past were generally civil rights charges that were brought against them, but not criminal charges. And so I wasn't surprised at all. And it's following a trend that's not only taking place in New York, but across this country, because this is the same situation, the same facts of what we've been confronted with in Ferguson with the Michael Brown shooting.
And Amy, the difference between this case and the Michael Brown case is we actually had very powerful video that everyone was able to see, including the grand jury. We saw the events unfold. Did you think at all that this case would be different because of that reason from Ferguson?
No, actually not really. I think that people know what the police department is doing in New York, and they are aware of police violence in their communities around the country. I think that it increased public awareness, but I don't necessarily think that it did anything to obviously increase the accountability of the police officers involved. I think the police officers in New York act with impunity in cases like this.
And Ronald, you just alluded to this, the fact that most police officers, when they are up against an indictment, they more often than not are not indicted. It's very, very rare. I just want you to talk a little bit about why that is.
Well, because prosecutors and police work very closely together. They are partners. They bring cases, police officers bring cases to the court. Prosecutors prosecute cases to court, and they use the testimony of police officers. But aside from that, members of our organization and a lot of other organizations in the country have been pushing mayors and governors to appoint special prosecutors to handle police cases, so that because of that relationship, they can't seem to be impartial And after they develop these relationships, I mean, the situation in Ferguson is a perfect example. This guy's father was shot and killed by somebody, and he was a police officer. Plus, he has police officers in his family, and he worked very closely with all the police officers in St. Louis County. So now he's expected to prosecute a police officer? Come on, let's be real. That hasn't been the case. And again, those cases that have been brought in New York City have been a result of either from a prosecutor from the Department of Justice or somebody that wasn't working daily with the police. And again, I would say this, that this is an argument and a point for body cameras. Not body cameras 100% of the solution to stop police brutality, because a camera what alerted us to this. So I think citizens have to be really careful. We ought to have body cameras now, but we need to have a whole lot of policies and other things that to accompany that.
And as I understand it, the young gentleman who actually videoed this this whole incident found himself in some trouble, which is so interesting because the whole reason why we can have this conversation is because of him. But Amy, I want to toss a similar question to you, which is that do you think the grand jury tends to sympathize more with the police officer? Do you think because of you know, how the police officer is perceived as a person of the law, that you know, decisions usually tend to be in their favor?
I'm not sure if I necessarily believe that. I think that a lot of it has to do with again, the relationship between prosecutors and police. The grand jury is only seeing what the prosecutor shows them. And so they are getting, you know, they're getting a view that is coming through a prism of somebody who works very closely with the police department. And I also think that you have to, you know, account for the fact that grand juries in cases like this have the same, you know, racial attitudes, the same economic, you know, biases that everybody in larger society does. And I think that when the victim is black or a person of color, I think oftentimes that bias plays an important role.
And Amy, a lot of people will look at this decision and say, you know, the officer may have broken an NYPD policy, which is that he used this chokehold, but it was not a criminal act. The chokehold is not a crime. And that, you know, they say, okay, sure, he should be fired, but he shouldn't be thrown in jail. How do you see it?
Well, I think, first of all, because the consequences are so large, he didn't just use a chokehold. He used a chokehold and he killed somebody. So I think there's that. But I also think that there should be criminal penalties for police officers who abuse their power.
So
and
that should be changed.
That should be changed. It's difficult to do, and you know, we want police to be able to do their job. But at the same time, you can't have police officers committing violent acts against people and not facing punishment that normal people would face if they had that kind of violence.
And go ahead, Ronald.
Oh no, I mean, Amy makes my point. See, if I put a chokehold on you and you get out of the chokehold, then I'm going to be charged with assault. But if I put a chokehold on you and it results in your death, then I'm going to be charged with murder.
So do you think that the grand jury made a mistake in not being able to at least call that negligence that led to his death?
Well, again, the prosecutor makes their call, and the grand jury makes their decision based on the evidence that's presented, and also based on how the evidence is presented. Most people who live in our country and serve on juries are law-abiding citizens and want to be helpful in terms of the process. But when the process is tainted by the individual who leads the process, and that's the prosecutor, then you have to begin to look at who's prosecuting the case. That's why special prosecutors are key sometimes in these kind of situations, because they're impartial. They are not working for anybody other than getting the case before them through the grand jury process and not being worried about how a police officer or police officers are going to work with them on the case tomorrow. Because, see, there's no tomorrow about this. This is the focus of today's case and getting a decision against a police officer.
And Amy, since this incident took place, we've heard lots of activists, civil rights leaders call on a federal investigation to take place. You know, we saw that opened in Ferguson. Perhaps we haven't seen the pressure. Why haven't we seen one be opened?
I think you will see the pressure now. I think that people were just waiting and hoping that the grand jury would do, you know, the right thing or do something. I think that you will see that. New York has a long history of civil rights violations. The police department has had many investigations into excessive use of force. I think that you will definitely see that now, and I think that you will see a lot of really intense protests and activism until that happens.
Yeah, perhaps we'll see a civil rights charge and a conviction on that. Okay, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but Ronald E. Hampton, retired police officer with D.C. Metro Police, Amy Frame, Director of Digital Strategy at Million Hoodies Movement for Justice. Thank you both for coming on and weighing in on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.